Winston Churchill, the greatest statesman of the 20th century. A heroic figure of Britain, Winston Churchill is not merely a famous and well-regarded personality that we find in history books who was branded as the greatest statesman of the 20th century. He was the UK's former Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. He was also knighted by none other than Queen Elizabeth II, and in 1953 was vested with a symbol of the Order of the Garter. He was also given honorary citizenship in the United States in 1963. On top of that, Winston was a Nobel Prize recipient for literature. I could go on for hours discussing Winston's honors and decorations, but the point that I'm trying to make is that Winston Churchill certainly earned the respect of the world and his nation throughout his life. Although, what exactly did he do to gain such repute and recognition?
We should listen once again to the words of Mr. Churchill.
5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany.
While Churchill had been an inspiration to the masses, he did not come from such a humble background. In fact, he was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, a descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough and a prominent politician. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress. He was essentially a member of an aristocratic class with considerable privilege. Our greatest statesman was not always great. In his early years, Winston went to Harrow Prep School, where he was considered to be an underachiever. His poor academic record only strengthened his father's decision to send him to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1893. It was there where Winston applied himself seriously, and he graduated 20th in a class of 130 in 1893. After graduating, Winston began his career path as a soldier and a journalist while traveling across the British Empire, and thus his path to greatness really started to go on a full swing. In 1899, his infamous bathroom window escape from capture during the coverage of the Boer War in South Africa earned him a little recognition back home in Britain. A year later, at the age of 26, he had already published 5 books of his own. Eventually, Churchill decided to follow his father's footsteps and started a career in politics, where he was elected to Parliament in the same year and joined as a Conservative.
But I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war.
Churchill was an idealist and a pragmatist, a gifted orator who advocated for progressive social reforms such as free trade and low tariffs. For this reason, Churchill often went into arguments with his colleagues in the Conservative Party. One fitting example of such arguments was when the Conservative Party decided to pursue a protectionist law called the Empire Free Trade, which imposed tariffs on imports. After a series of arguments between Churchill and the members of the Conservative Party, Churchill realized that he no longer aligns with the Conservative Party. This eventually led Churchill to deviate from the Conservative chamber years later and would soon become part of the Liberal side of the chamber.
We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end.
Despite having been from a privileged background belonging to Britain's upper class, he put forward some of the reforms that benefited British laborers. Among these reforms include the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, labor exchange for unemployed workers, and public health insurance. While this may have translated to treachery for his former co-conservatives, this was certainly a work of a capable and great statesman for the British public. Despite the existence of his pro-labor laws, Churchill was not necessarily seen by laborers in a good light. There was a time when the Labour Party did not particularly like how Churchill dealt with labor unions. One notable instance was in the 1911 Welsh coal miners' strike, wherein Churchill allegedly deployed troops against the miners. Although this was proven to be just a mere allegation, this narrative put Churchill in a bad light for the laborers. However, Churchill cannot be labeled simply as pro-labor or anti-labor. One can say that he had a love-hate relationship with labor unions, for Churchill was essentially anti-communist and anti-socialist. He proclaimed himself to be a Tory Democrat whose aim is to modernize the British government and improve the standard of living for British citizens. He stood for what he thought was best for the British citizens. His pro-labor laws were only its manifestations. Eventually, Churchill shifted his attention from domestic affairs toward external affairs when he served as the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. He was in charge of Britain's naval affairs. During his term, he modernized the British fleet and the Royal Naval Air Service and was an instrument in the creation of the world's earliest tanks. However, his success in improving Britain's military capacity was not enough to gain a significant advantage for Britain during the First World War. Churchill's capability of being a leader was questioned when his invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, Turkey, in a 1915 initiative miserably failed. His goal to undermine the Ottoman Empire and persuade the Balkan countries to join their side along with the Allies failed when the battle ended in a stalemate, with around 250,000 casualties on both sides. This is where Churchill's career as the First Lord of Admiralty ultimately ended. The Gallipoli incident probably undermined Churchill's repute. To the British public, Churchill was the boy who cried wolf when he constantly warned of another impending war when the Nazis came into power in 1933. Many opted not to listen to Churchill's warnings, even though the main driver that pushed the British public to avoid interfering with the Nazi operations was because of exhaustion from the previous war. Despite Churchill's warnings, the British government merely evaded Hitler's affairs and even agreed to give Germany a portion of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace in 1938 through the Munich Agreement, at the initiative of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. They would soon realize that Hitler was not a man of promise. A year after the agreement, Hitler decided to invade Poland anyway, forcing Britain and France to declare war. The failure of the Munich Agreement lost the Parliament's confidence over Neville Chamberlain, which prompted his eventual resignation. Soon after, Churchill replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May 1940. Upon taking his seat as Prime Minister, he only hoped and promised the British people one thing: victory, albeit a long and difficult road needs to be undertaken before achieving such. Indeed, it was not easy for the Allies when the Nazis captured France in June 1940, and when the Germans did air raids on Britain the following month.
This is what the German Air Force has done to our beautiful London. We shall not cry about it. It's the German method of making war. Isn't it time that the citizens of Berlin, too, should know this kind of horror? Let them suffer what London suffers. In this war, we've been told that we are all in the front line, but German citizens must be in the front line, too.
Despite such adversities, Churchill was a man of inspiration and charismatic rhetoric. He secured support from the USA through the Lend-Lease program, wherein the USA sent war supplies such as planes, tanks, guns, and ammunition to Britain. This initiative by Churchill was one of the defining reasons for the victory of the Allies and Germany's eventual surrender. However, the already worn-out British public, done with the devastations of two wars, overthrew the Conservative Party, and Churchill, along with it, from office. While it may have been considered then as a dreadful end for Churchill's career, the greatest statesman proved everyone wrong when he was able to regain his seat as Prime Minister in 1951 at 77 years old. In his remaining years, he was given due recognition for all his contributions during the World Wars. In 1953, his expansive and well-described account of the Second World War earned him a Nobel Prize for Literature. Yet his legacy did not end with all his awards and decorations. Despite his old age, the greatest statesman was still in action, warning the Americans and the British of the communist threat brought about by the expansion of the Soviet Union. a warning for another impending conflict between the democratic and the communist states. Winston may have started life as an underachiever at school, yet he left the world with a legacy of being the greatest statesman of the 20th century. Although his journey was not smooth sailing and he committed lapses along the way, his noteworthy contributions during his lifetime still left millions of Britons to benefit and a legacy to remember. Thank you for listening. In case you didn't know, hitting the like button helps the channel quite a bit. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can join me again next time as we look into the life of other historical figures that shaped the world as we know it.